Spectrovision Radio.
When I tell you this story, I know you're not going to believe me that it's true. So before I do, I'm going to play you the only bit of what you might call evidence that still exists. A recording from a police interview I was able to get access to. I've omitted the sections where names are used, and I'll anonymise people and places throughout my account, the motivations for which I'm sure will become clear once you hear what I have to say. As evidence, I concede it's tangential at best, but after an exhaustive search, it's the only thing I could find even remotely connected to what I'm about to say, even if it does only scratch the surface of one small element of the enormity of what happened, and offers up its own set of peculiar mysteries. Anyway, I guess I better play you that recording before I say any more.
At this time, counsel will read a pre-prepared statement on behalf of my client. After the conclusion of the statement, my client will invoke their right to remain silent and will not be answering any questions. This may be unorthodox, but counsel wishes to make clear, for the record, that this statement and its contents are being read specifically at my client's request. The statement reads as follows. I have debts. I will not go into what kind. The important thing is that for a long time, I owed money to the kind of people you really don't want to owe money to. I will not name these people due to fear for my life. At the time, said individuals approached me regarding the aggravated robbery which took place at the medical facility, which I have been arrested in connection with. I'd only just recovered from a broken arm, which was a result of me asking for more time to get said individuals their money. They wanted me to steal a truck and deliver it, with its cargo intact, to a drop-off point near airport. I was told not to ask any questions, and that I was not to inspect the cargo. That was made explicitly clear to me. I was told to steal the truck from the location provided to me, to drive following instructions that would also be provided, to leave the truck where instructed, and then to walk away. These individuals promised me that if I did as I was told, my debt would be wiped, and they would leave me alone. They told me I had an hour to decide. I tried to weigh up how much time in prison I could get for stealing and transporting whatever it was that was in that truck, versus the consequences of still being indebted to them. Desperation to be free from them motivated my decision to take the risk. Excuse me, I just need a sip of water. I was told where the truck would be and instructed to steal it on the morning of this year. When I arrived at the location, I expected to find the cab of the truck empty. But as I neared, I saw that there was someone sitting in the driver's seat. Fearing he would drive away, and that I would lose my chance to rid myself of my debt and the threats against my life, I opened the door to the cab and screamed at the driver to get out. I threatened him with a knife, though I had no intentions of using it, and he climbed out. I lied and told him I knew who he was, and that if he called the cops, dangerous people would come after him and his family. He told me that his paycheck wasn't worth the trouble, and that he wouldn't sound the alarm. 20 minutes into my trajectory, before I'd even left the city limits, I stopped at a red light in order to not draw attention to myself. While I was waiting, I watched as a man wearing an oversized black coat and a baseball cap shuffled off of the sidewalk and came to a stop in the middle of the crosswalk. His skin was very pale, eyes fixed on the ground, and he seemed to be talking to himself. The light turned green, and I gave him a few seconds to realize before giving him a quick blast of my horn. He turned to face me and pulled a gun out of his coat and pointed it toward me, now striding quickly in the direction of the truck. I could hear him screaming, "Get out of the truck! Get out of the truck!" A pounding noise made me jerk my head, and I saw another person with similarly pale skin and yellowing eyes, slamming their fists into the locked door and window to my right, trying to get into the truck. I then saw that there was another one of them approaching, carrying a baseball bat. They clearly wanted what was in the truck, or needed it. I hit the gas and prayed the man with the gun would move out of the way. He darted to his left just as I was about to smash into him. I sped away and didn't look back. It made me think that I was transporting what must have been drugs, which wasn't a surprise to me. But the group of people who tried to jump me, who clearly knew what was in the truck, weren't any type of gang or organized crime group. They were desperate, unwell. I don't understand how people like that got tipped off. I started to worry that someone might have witnessed their attempted ambush, that someone may have called the cops and described what they'd seen, the truck, maybe even the license plate. I was tempted to ditch the truck and run, but instead I found myself pulling over, climbing out and opening up the back to inspect what I was hauling, even though I'd been explicitly told not to. The labeling on the boxes made me think the cargo was some kind of medical supplies, and I assumed they must be pharmaceutical drugs. But when I opened one up, I found that it was full of blood bags, the kind you use for transfusions. I opened a few more, and all of them contained the same thing. Every single box was full of blood bags. The fear of what would happen to me if I didn't finish the job kicked back in, and I decided to get back behind the wheel. I got to the drop-off point near the airport without any more trouble, and left the truck where I'd been instructed. I have not had any contact with the individuals who offered to wipe my debts if I stole the truck since, and I have no idea why anyone might have wanted all that blood. That concludes my client's statement. Again, we will not be answering any questions.
Where this story really starts is when I received an email from an old colleague. We'll call him Ulrich. It was a genuine surprise to hear from him. We hadn't really seen eye to eye when we'd worked together at the same university, where we'd both been astrobiologists, specializing in research concerning the origins of life on Earth. We weren't exactly friends, and there were even periods of time when we weren't on speaking terms, but our disagreements had never boiled over into something more than cutting remarks. It was really just two incompatible personalities brushing up against each other. We were both ambitious, was the thing, competitive and trying to best each other to the little money available in the way of research grants. But we exhibited it in different ways. Ulrich was like a bull, charging at whatever he wanted and trusting his passion and talent to see him through. I was more like a fox, able to cunningly weave through the political landscape that exists at the heart of any institution and rely on relationships to see me through. So even though I suspected Ulrich was probably a more gifted scientist than I was, when funding cuts came and one of us had to be shown the door, he was the one forcibly ushered out. He took it as expected, badly. I thought he was someone I would never see or hear from again, and I was just fine with that. So when I saw his name pop up in my inbox, I at first thought maybe it was some kind of spam that had come from his account and had simply been sent to everyone who'd ever been in his contact list. The subject line was blank, but curiosity got the better of me and I opened it. The body of the email contained just 3 words. "I've found something." That's all it said, and his phone number was at the bottom of the email. Okay, yeah, spam, I thought. I tried to forget about it, but for some reason, chalk it up to being a good Samaritan, I felt the need to let him know his email was sending out nonsense. I decided to call him, telling myself it'd last no more than a few minutes, and that he'd probably tell me his password had been breached or something. But when he answered the phone and realized it was me calling, his response was not what I'd anticipated. "Thomas," he said, "I'm so glad you called." And then he repeated the 3 words from his email. "I've found something." "What have you found?" I asked. "Something that blows the story of the origin of life on our planet wide open," he said. "The Ishua belt?" I asked, taking an educated guess at where he'd made the discovery. Ulrich scoffed. "What I found makes the Ishua belt about as special as a broken toaster," he replied. I was of course skeptical, but he sounded so earnest, so resolute, that I found myself growing intrigued. "What do you need me for?" I asked. "My team," he said with a rueful exhalation. "They're competent, but they don't truly understand. I need someone with your experience, someone at my level, to ratify this and do what needs to be done." I paused, listening to the crackle of his breath on the line, and looked around my office. It had been a while since I'd been out in the field, confined instead to teaching and research that felt increasingly academic, and I couldn't pretend I hadn't missed it. But Ulrich spoke again before I could. He told me to send him my passport details, and that he'd make all the travel arrangements. "I haven't agreed to come yet," I said. Ulrich laughed. "Oh, you're coming," he said. "You wouldn't want to miss this for the world." After a long journey to one of Earth's legitimately far-flung places, I felt sleep-deprived and jet-lagged in that way when your perspective on things gets strange, dreamlike, and difficult as the helicopter touched down. Ulrich was there waiting, wrapped up warm against the cold, arm raised against the wind generated by the propellers. I hopped out of the chopper and we exchanged shouted greetings as the pilot gave us a thumbs up and took off again. I could see the small research station up ahead, and we walked in its direction as Ulrich asked me how the journey had been. As we trudged carefully over the uneven terrain of the tundra, I noticed a shuffle to his gait that he hadn't had before, a slight limp that looked like it might have been caused by an injury. "Everything okay?" I asked, looking down at his leg so he'd know what I was referring to. "Oh, that," he replied. I slipped and twisted it. "Nothing serious." We arrived at the station. It was a little cramped, but in good condition and by no means the worst I'd ever seen. Ulrich led me through to the kitchen and set about making some coffee and told me to take a load off, so I dropped down into one of the chairs at the table. "Where are the rest of your team?" I asked, assuming they must have been at the discovery site of whatever it was Ulrich claimed to have found. Ulrich sighed heavily. "I sent them home," he said. "Why?" I asked, taking a mug of hot coffee from his outstretched hand. He shook his head and took a seat opposite me. "They didn't appreciate or properly understand what I'm doing here," he replied. "So it's literally just you and me?" I said. He nodded, and I felt a pang of anxiety rattle against the bars of my ribcage. It had been so long since we'd worked together that I realized the man I was staring across the table at was really a stranger, and that perhaps he always had been. Ulrich seemed to sense my shift and cleared his throat forcefully before shuffling forward in his chair, his face growing more serious. "Look," he said, "I know you've come out here on a leap of faith, so why don't I cut to the chase and make it worth it, right off the bat?" I nodded at him. That was exactly what I needed. "Drilling into the ice," he said, his eyes locking unwaveringly with mine, "we came upon an opening. We excavated, and it turned out to be the entrance to a cave that had been sealed under ancient ice." "How ancient?" I asked. "As ancient as it gets," he replied, "and judging by the dating tests, it's been locked away down there pretty much forever. We are the only humans that have ever accessed it," he added. It was intriguing, no doubt about it, but I knew that we hadn't even begun to talk about the reason he'd really brought me there. "Before I show you what's in that cave," he said, with a deadly seriousness that made that rattle in my chest start up again, "I need you to understand something." "What?" I asked. "Do not be afraid," he replied, with an earnestness that deeply unsettled me. "What I've found is going to save us all." Ulrich guided me along a path that had been created by flags and ropes, all the way across the tundra and out onto the ice, and down a makeshift ramp they constructed through the excavation. At the bottom of the ramp, I could see the opening of the cave, a black maw no bigger than the size of a door. I began to move towards it, but Ulrich didn't follow. "I think when you first see it," he said, "it's better you see it alone." I didn't understand what he meant, but continued on ahead anyway. Just before the threshold was a generator, which I knew would be connected to lights they would have erected in the cave, so I cranked it on and watched as the black opening began to emit an off-white glow. I edged through a short, narrow passage and quickly found myself entering a small chamber. It was clear immediately what it was that Ulrich had found. Opposite me in that space was something my mind couldn't comprehend, and I can only describe it piece by piece. I was staring at what looked like a large, vaguely human head, one that was about 6 feet tall and 3 feet wide. It was motionless, and it looked overly smooth, skin almost translucent, like something in a fetal stage. It had no eyes or nose that I could discern, only what looked like a mouth that had no lips, and was really just a gaping, circular hole, inside which was only pitch black nothing. That strange, oversized head was all that was visible. It looked like it was being balanced on something, but I couldn't see what, as a tarp had been draped around everything below its chin, if you could call it that. Was it the rest of its body? Did it have a body? I moved closer, outstretched my hand to move the tarp aside and see what was beneath. I wouldn't do that if I were you. I turned to see Ulrich had entered the cave. I'd been so perplexed by what I was seeing, I hadn't even heard him approach. I was too dumbfounded to respond, but he walked towards me, his bad leg dragging somewhat, making a rustling sound as it scraped against the ground. "It's just the head, but it's fragile to the point of collapse," he said. He motioned to the tarp. I reinforced it, but the slightest movement could. He trailed off. "Is it alive?" I asked, feeling more lost than I ever had in my life. Ulrich shook his head. "No," he replied, with a certainty that somehow made me believe him. "Ulrich, what is this?" I asked. He smiled. "I'm not exactly sure yet," he admitted. "But if you think your mind is blown now, wait until you see what I have in the lab." Ulrich showed me the tests he'd run. I checked and rechecked, and then checked again. He'd conducted them properly, and the results were genuine. "It's as old as life on this planet," he said, staring at me as I slumped in my chair in the lab, reeling from the enormity of what the samples I was looking at were seemingly telling me. "How is that possible?" I asked out loud, not expecting an answer. "Exactly," he replied, We need to rethink the way we see the evolution of life on Earth entirely. My temples throbbed. I hadn't slept in so long, and he was moving too fast for me in what was already an impossible situation. How is it so intact? I asked, trying to focus on smaller, but probably no more manageable pieces of the mystery, this time looking at him and genuinely asking for an opinion. It's so well preserved because of the temperature and the inaccessibility of the cave. It would have been impervious to changes outside, he answered. I shook my head. I knew that wasn't right, and I knew Ulrich knew it too. It flew in the face of everything our expertise told us. But he spoke again before I could argue. These questions. This is why you're here, he said enthusiastically. We can't alert anyone to this until you've investigated it further. He placed a hand on my shoulder, forced me to make eye contact with him again. This is why I need you, he said, to make sure this is really what it seems before we tell anyone. It made some kind of strange sense to me, but I realized the colossal nature of what I'd been exposed to had prevented something else from dawning on me. How much did your team know? I asked. How can you be so sure they won't say anything? Ulrich moved towards the door, stopped just before he reached its threshold. I can promise you they'll keep quiet, he said, before turning away and leaving me alone in the lab. I spent the rest of the day in the lab looking at more of the samples Ulrich and his now departed team had taken, conducting my own retests, but coming up with the same answers they had. I searched every part of my brain for another explanation. I wondered if they'd faked the samples somehow. I wondered if I'd been sucked into a hoax. I wondered if there was something up there that was making us hallucinate. It all became too much, and I went to bed with my mind feeling like an impossible labyrinth. Desperate for sleep, I was unconscious pretty much the second my head hit the pillow. I woke up in the middle of the night, with the sense that I could hear a distant voice. It sounded like it was coming from outside, so I got up and edged over to the small window in my room. Illuminated by the flashlight he was carrying, I saw Ulrich plodding back in the direction of the station. In the dead silence of that remote night, I could hear him talking, though I couldn't make out what he was saying. He was alone, of course, talking only to himself. I darted away from the window, not wanting him to see me there watching him, and retreated back into bed. As I lay back down, I realized I'd left the room to my door slightly ajar. I heard Ulrich enter the station. He was no longer talking to himself. From my position on the bed, I squinted and looked through the narrowly opened door and watched him walk towards me and then turn right, heading off to his room, and heard him close the door behind him. I lay there, unmoving, trying to process something, trying to make sense of what I thought I'd seen as I watched him shuffle past my bedroom door. I was fairly sure his eyes had been closed. I told myself it must have been a trick of the low light, or the fact I was still severely jet-lagged, sleep-deprived, that my head was a mess after the shattering impossibility of what he'd shown me in that cave and the results in the lab. Quietly as I could, I got up, closed my bedroom door, and locked it. The next morning, after no more than a couple of hours of dreamless sleep, I came into the main room to find Ulrich eating breakfast. "Where were you last night?" I asked. He said, still chewing and not looking up. "I couldn't sleep," I added, pouring myself some coffee, wanting to seem unfazed. "I heard you leave and come back a while later." "I went out to check on it," he said. "Check the integrity of the support I set up." Ulrich got up from his chair at the table, and I noticed he was limping, much more than he had been the previous day, as he went over to the sink to wash out his bowl. Blood was soaking through the leg of his trouser. "Your leg? It's bleeding badly," I said, alarmed and confused. "I thought you said you twisted it." "I did," he replied, a hint of annoyance creeping into his tone. "But I landed on some of the equipment when I fell. Cut it up." I stared at it intently, taking in just how much blood there was. "Ulrich, you need medical attention," I said. He waved his hand at me dismissively. "It's a surface wound," he replied. "Looks far worse than it is." I convinced him that he at least needed to clean it up and rebandage it, and volunteered to go grab some from the supply room. He nodded and offered a less than heartfelt thank you. In the supply room, I found the first aid stuff quickly enough. But something else caught my eye while I was in there, something that stood out against the otherwise typically well-organized supplies. It was a large backpack, and it looked like it had just been tossed against a wall in there, zip open at the top. Curious, I unzipped it fully and rummaged through it. It had some clean clothes in it, a shaving kit, and something else. A small plastic tube. It took me a second to realize what it was. An epinephrine auto-injector. I made my way back to Ulrich, who was still where I'd left him. "Did one of your crew have some kind of severe allergy?" I asked. Ulrich looked away from me, taking a while before offering a reply. "Joachim," he said eventually. "Nuts, I think." I told Ulrich about the bag I'd found. "He must have forgotten it," he said, shrugging. "Should we call him on the satellite phone? Let him know?" I asked. "He might still be travelling and not realise he doesn't have it on him. He'll need to get another one in case." Ulrich nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said uncertainly. "Thing is, I haven't been able to get the satellite phone to work." "Since when?" I asked. "Since you arrived, actually," he replied. Feeling those pangs of worry hit up against my ribs again, I asked Ulrich if I could take a look at it, and he grabbed it from his room and gave it to me. The screen was blank. I plugged it in, checking it wasn't a charge issue, but nothing happened. I replaced the battery with a spare from the supply room, but again, nothing. "And this is the only one?" I asked Ulrich, knowing the answer, but still in disbelief that he could be so irresponsible. "It's the only one, I'm afraid," he confirmed. I looked down at that useless hunk of plastic in my hands, the rhythm of the pangs in my chest, now a constant beat, that threatened to explode. "When is the helicopter scheduled to come back?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Not for another fortnight," he said. That night, sleep felt like a wonderful concept that existed only in fairy tales. Instead, as I lay there contemplating how far away I was from the temporary salvage of unconsciousness, I felt trapped, scared, part of something I couldn't understand. We'd been out to the cave again, to gather new samples. Ulrich seemed to be going through the motions, but it was obvious he had no interest in the work. He took every chance he could to just stand there, staring at the head. I didn't see how he could. I looked at it as little as possible. That huge, unthinkable face that seemed to be watching me, even though it had no eyes. I asked Ulrich if we should check the reinforcements that he'd laid beneath the tarp that was supporting it, but he told me emphatically that there was no need. When I mentioned it again, he burned a hole in me with a wide-eyed stare that made me physically flinch. Once we returned to the station, I barely got any work done in the lab. I had to concentrate as hard as I could to stop myself from hyperventilating, from entering full panic. I'd never felt so alone, so vulnerable, never felt so unwound from the fabric of reality. So that night, unable to sleep, I crept out of my room. Ulrich had passed out on the sofa and was making unintelligible mumbling sounds in his sleep. With the opportunity to stare at him without him knowing, I was able to take in just how badly his leg was bleeding. Quietly as I could, I moved away and exited the station. I made my way out to the cave, turned on the generator, and ventured inside. Staring at the head, I was convinced it looked different somehow, like it might have moved, balancing at an ever so slightly different angle than it had been earlier. But there was something else, something far more irrefutable than a nebulous sense that something had changed. Barely a foot from that thing, there was blood in the ice, a shock of browning scarlet standing out against the bluish white. A sound made me spin around on the spot, and I saw Ulrich limping into the cave, his injury now meaning there was no disguising the sound of his dragging leg. He'd followed me out there. "What are you doing?" he asked, the words sharpened into a demand. I hesitated, unsure of which of the many questions racing through my mind I wanted to ask first. "What happened to the rest of your team, Ulrich?" I said. Ulrich shuffled closer, and I felt myself moving backwards, away from him. Every colossal shift incurs casualties, he replied. In that moment, I made a split-second decision before the choice was taken away from me. I turned back around to face the head and snatched at the tarp, ripping it away from whatever it was concealing. And when I did, I saw that there was nothing even remotely like what Ulrich had claimed beneath it. No support structure to balance the head, keep it upright and intact. Instead, I saw that the being before me did indeed have something akin to a body, only one unlike anything I'd ever seen. That head was perched atop what looked like a massive, translucent sack, one which was around a quarter full of blood. Staring at that absurd anatomy, I realized, but didn't understand, what had happened to Ulrich's team. You fed them to it, didn't you? I cried. And you've been draining your own blood from your leg to feed it too. Ulrich had come to a stop, now just staring at me. Thomas, you are standing on the precipice of the most important thing that has ever happened to our world, he said sternly. All we need to do is to give it back its life force, make it stronger so it can do what needs to be done. So you make it get stronger, and then it's going to do God knows what, I shouted at him, my voice cracking with desperation. God? He asked, incredulously. Even God doesn't know what I know. And what is it that you know, Ulrich? I asked, not truly comprehending if I wanted the answer. It's been speaking to me when I'm alone with it, he replied. It needs me to wake it up. Staring back at him, trapped in that terrifying space where the rules of reality had imploded, I found myself shaking uncontrollably. And what happens when it wakes? I asked. Ulrich stood silent a moment, gazed up at the roof of the cave. We wonder what's out there, he mused. We think there must be something, intelligent life, somewhere in the endless expanse of the universe. He reverted his gaze back to me. But the truth is, we are alone, he added. We always have been, and we always will be. And that's okay, because it told me the true laws of existence, of creation. He limped closer to that terrifying thing, his eyes now brimming with wonder and adoration. This being is older than time itself, and it has one function, he said. When a world becomes untenable, it swallows the consciousness of everything on that planet, and then releases it as the beginnings of new life on a new world. That is the true cycle of life in the cosmos. He turned back to me. I need to wake it up, because our world is dying, and it is the only way we can start again somewhere else, he said, his words full of purpose. Ulrich, can you hear yourself? I asked. Do you have any idea how insane you sound? You've seen it, he barked. Its existence already rewrites everything you thought you knew. So is it really that crazy? I shook my head, as if I could rattle myself awake from that terrible nightmare. Let's say I believe you, that it's been communicating with you somehow, I said, once I'd conceded it was no dream. How do you know that you can trust it? How do you know what it's telling you is true? I know, he said firmly. And that involves it killing every last person on the planet, I replied. Ulrich looked at me like I was stupid, or like I'd gone mad. To be reborn, he said, not as the individuals we are now, but as part of the seed that will grow into new life on an uninhabited world. We will all be the thing that powers the very first microorganism to exist there, its evolution over millennia into intelligent life. I stared back at him, and in that moment I realized I didn't know if I was more afraid of that inexplicable being in the cave with us, or of the man standing before me. I thought you'd understand, Ulrich said. I thought you'd help me do what needs to be done. I didn't reply. My voice had stopped working. I felt as if I was going to pass out. Ulrich's energy shifted, his expression morphed. It was as if he was trying to become less combative, like he thought there might still be a chance to win me over. "We need a lot more blood," he said, like I'd somehow agreed to some invisible plan. I tried to get some flown in, but he trailed off. "I know," he said suddenly. "I'll show you that it's working, that it's slowly waking up. Then you'll see. Then you'll help me." Ulrich pulled up his trouser leg, and I finally saw his wound for the first time. One he'd clearly made himself, and had been opening again and again. He retrieved a knife from his pocket and sliced into the fleshy opening, causing a waterfall of blood to come gushing out. From his coat, he pulled out a petri dish and gathered the red liquid, and then raised it to what I'd always assumed was the thing's mouth. He poured the blood into that circular, lipless black opening and stood back. I waited, but nothing happened. "Just be patient, because Ulrich never got a chance to finish that sentence. Suddenly, the being lurched forward, taking Ulrich by surprise. It locked its mouth around his face. Ulrich's limbs flailed wildly as it tilted its head back and made a horrible gulping sound. I watched as Ulrich's movements slowed, and all the color was drained from his skin, and as he shrunk, while the being drank the entire contents of his body. Once he'd been entirely drained, it released its mouth's grip, and an empty sack made entirely of skin, all that was left of Ulrich, dropped to the ground. And then it turned to me, and I realized that despite having no eyes to see me with, no ears to hear me with, no nose to smell me with, it knew I was there. I turned and ran as fast as I could, scrambling out of the cave and sprinting up the ramp, making quick panic glances over my shoulder as it took after me. I couldn't even tell how it was propelling itself forward. It just was, almost as if it was gliding over the ground, rushing like running water. It chased me out over the ice and onto the tundra. I kept stumbling on the uneven ground, kept almost falling, but sheer desperation kept me upright. Suddenly, I felt something shift. I heard a high-pitched sound followed by the sensation that my ears had become completely blocked. "Thomas, do not be afraid," a voice said. "This is what is required to start again, for the next cycle to commence somewhere new." The voice carried through the air in a way that didn't make sense. It was like it was somehow able to hijack the space between us and create the disturbing illusion it was speaking from right beside me. I found myself screaming louder than I ever had in an attempt to block it out, but it kept repeating those words, kept talking to me as if it was right by me. I ran and ran, screaming until my throat gave out. I felt like I was tiring, losing pace, but I realized when I turned and looked over my shoulder that it wasn't gaining on me. And I realized, or rather hoped, that it too was tiring. I clung to that notion, used it as fuel, made it the focal point of my desire to survive. It was still talking to me, but I concentrated as hard as I could to make space for my own thoughts as I forced myself to keep scrambling over the rocky terrain. "It's not had enough blood yet," I told myself. "It's still weak. Keep going." Eventually, I looked back and saw that I'd gained ground on it. I dropped my pace, but kept going, and I saw that I was right. It was slowing down, and eventually its movements became little more than a crawl. I watched as it came to a stop and fell to one side. I waited until I was convinced it was no longer capable of chasing me, and cautiously approached, until I was no more than a few feet away from it. That dreadful head with its single orifice feature, and the undulating blood bag it was connected to. "This is your last chance to feed me," that voice said, but it was weaker now. "To save all life by giving it its next chance." But staring down at that monstrous thing, I didn't believe it. I watched it as its rasping breath got slower, became a deathly rattle. I watched until it stopped moving, until that terrifying blood bag that constituted its body stopped pulsating, and as it became statuesquely still, much like when I'd first seen it. No part of me felt like it was over. So I made my way back to the station, every fibre of my body pleading for rest. But I couldn't stop now. I gathered the things I needed to finish the deed and headed back out, praying that abominable thing would still be there, that it wouldn't have found it within itself to hide in the meantime. But it was still there, still frozen in that same awful, open-mouthed pose. Part of me was tempted to stare at it a while, take in this thing that simply should not be, before I lost the chance to ever contemplate it again. Fuck that, I told myself, and I set about planting the thermite charges I'd taken from the station, enough to send it to Kingdom Come and beyond. And I blew it up so hard, you'd never know it had been there at all. Eventually, the authorities had no choice but to let me go. I don't know how much they truly believed my story, that Ulrich had gone mad and murdered his crew before I'd even got there, and then tried to murder me before disappearing into the night. Trying to move on, to lead a normal life after experiencing such a thing, is a tall order. But I'm trying. I've been trying for a long time. Some days, the muscle memory of what was my routine for so many years kicks in, enough for me to get by. And if you met me on one of those days, you'd have no idea what had happened to me, that I'd experienced something that pulls the rug of reality right out from underneath you. But other days, when it's windy and the trash blows around my feet as I walk, when the taste of car fumes hits my tongue as I navigate the streets, are not so easy. Sometimes, I look out at the malignant smog that hangs over the city, or at the insidious chemical sludge that gathers at the edges of the river that runs through it, and I think of what we've done to this place, and I wonder if Ulrich wasn't so crazy after all. I wonder if that terrifying being really was offering some kind of salvation. The reason I've decided to tell you this story now is because sometimes I struggle to decide my identity. I'm either the man who saved the world, or the man who condemned it. But I'm not sure you can give me the answer.